Is Total War Pharaoh on the ropes, or is it coming into a new era for a series that has had a few mishaps in the last few years and really been focusing on the fantasy world? The historical lads seem to have been left behind, and I don't know, I don't speak for everyone, but I feel a little bit neglected. I've wanted something amazing since Attila, and yeah, I actually really enjoyed Three Kingdoms, but it wasn't true history. But Pharaoh is hoping to do such a thing. Yet, since the last few games have been a bit wishy-washy, especially Troy, who tried to go back into the Bronze Age of history and then kind of messed it up at the last second, people aren't quite sure. They're skeptical. But I feel a little bit different. I feel skeptically optimistic. Creative Assembly, unfortunately, were very mean to me, and they kicked me out of the Total War creator thing, so I am on the same page as you guys. I haven't played the game. I have no exclusive info or early access stuff. However, I do have the patience to sit through all their videos and every bit of info, so I thought I'd bring you guys my thoughts. All the info we have so far, and why I'm actually kind of looking forward to Total War Pharaoh. They are bringing back a lot of old features. Now, this is a great thing, but also has been met with some criticism. People saying that they wanted new things and not just stuff that the old Total Wars did, which I think is somewhat a fair point. I would love to see something really innovative. Yet, however, with most things, you need to take it back to the base level if you're going to build it up again. And I think Total War has strayed so far about what made it great that they do need to give at least one or maybe two games of bringing the basis back of Total War, the things that people fell in love with, to get at least the fans back on their side. And that's definitely what they're doing with Pharaoh. Throughout your campaign, you can put down outposts. These can be military or economic. They're sort of forts that can be constructed on the map themselves. Players can then keep your armies in it and protect your territory, almost like a temporary city to make a stronghold in case you're at war or you just need some help if your guys are starving out in the desert. There are also things like monuments. These can be constructed across the land, and they can bring you reputation and other buffs. Well, one of the main things to start you on your road to becoming Pharaoh, which is the main aim of the game. Stuck in this civil war, there is a vacuum of power, and it is you vying to get into this position. There are so many different ways how you can try and get up your reputation in order to get that title of Pharaoh. However, one of the main ones is monuments. But going back to outposts, especially the military ones, they're almost like checkpoints across deserts. They can be changed and upgraded throughout your campaign. Some can even help maintain your armies and give the troops better skills and armor, so on and so forth. And I do love this. But once again, this isn't anything new. It's a bit more of an advanced version of what we got in the first Rome Total War, being able to build forts out in the desert so you could change a pitched battle into more of a siege defense. Okay, it was just palisade walls, but they'd still need battering rams to get through or some sort of siege weaponry. It would help smaller armies take on bigger armies if they were stuck in a tricky situation, or they just needed someone to hold out until reinforcing armies came to free them. I really like that they're bringing this back, but they are also advancing on it somewhat, giving you the ability to have more economic advantages to putting down said outposts. Let's go into the combat though. This is where it gets spicy. See, they're bringing back all the old combat animations. For so long, we've had kind of more simplistic but larger scale battle mechanics. Because the games have had lots of extra things like flying abilities or magic and mythical creatures, the actual infantry to infantry combat has been simplified somewhat. But it's coming back in Pharaoh to be more weapon specific. Animations will be played depending on what weapons an attacker is using and how the defender chooses to counter said specific weapon. We saw this back in Rome 2, and of course Shogun 2 was very famous for this. These beautifully choreographed duels throughout the game. Now, I think a lot of people liked it. I really do like zooming in and seeing all these beautiful animations and kill moves, but it doesn't necessarily feel like the most realistic thing in the world. I think for a Total War game, it works fine, as long as we don't get that Rome 2 initial launch version of the combat, where every battle ends up just being 1v1s, and it just completely strays away from what would realistically happen in this ancient warfare style of setting. But I've been waiting for an ancient Total War for so long. Rome 2 is my favorite of all time. Okay, maybe you could say Rome 1. But I'm hoping that Pharaoh is going to recapture what at least Rome 2 and Attila had. The battles themselves are actually starting to look quite a lot like those Rome 2 Attila battles. I genuinely think it's the closest thing that we've had since Attila in terms of looks. Initially, many people thought that Total War Pharaoh looked a little bit too bright, vibrant, and almost like tacky and arcadey because they were basing it off what Troy had. And yeah, I also thought initially, especially the UI and the way the battles looked, seemed more like Troy than anything. But the more gameplay, especially the gameplay that was released the other day, makes this look more and more like Rome 2. And that is making me incredibly optimistic. At just over 12 minutes in the gameplay showcase, however, there is one tiny frame that I think many people will have missed, but it does give me some doubts. As cavalry isn't a massive part of this time era, we're going to be focusing a lot of chariots, cutting down enemies and charging into flanks. However, in this bit of gameplay, the chariots do charge at some archers, but they don't really have much impact. They kind of just stop in place and then all momentum is lost. And that does haunt me a little bit. From the early days of Rome 2, where cavalry charges had pretty much zero impact. Not seeing men flying away or spreading across the desert as they're impacted from behind like they did in the original Rome 1 or Medieval 2, then just kind of having the cavalry statically attack. And it is giving me some worries that this part, this tiny little frame, is the chariots having those similar Rome 2 charge mechanics rather than, well, what we had in Medieval 2, which I don't think any Total War has recaptured since then. But I might be being a bit too nitpicky, but let me know what you think down below. Sieges have changed a little bit, and they are going back to a little bit of what Rome 2 had by having certain victory points and certain areas to capture. Not just one capture point like the very early Total Wars, but not getting too bogged down in so many different areas like the Warhammer games. Yet, these victory points will give you buffs, or they can hurt the enemy. They can give your troops strength, or they can lose morale of the people defending. You can capture these certain points that will be spread around the cities, and the sieges in general feel much bigger than what Warhammer ever did. You see, Warhammer took sieges and kind of, at least many of them, gave them one phase of attack. I mean, for example, attacking a dwarf fortress in the Warhammer games. The sieges felt much smaller. They didn't give that same sort of scale and, I guess, choice that the older historical games did, where you had so many different areas to attack, weak points, and making the defenders spread out their troops with siege towers and knocking down other walls. So I'm glad that we're getting these larger scale sieges back in Pharaoh, back to the days of the ancient Total Wars. I am a bit skeptical about these points that you can, capture and attack. I'm glad that it doesn't end the battle like we had in the early Rome 2 versions. However, I still kind of miss the days of being able to choke point streets and hold one defensive point as you would in a city siege. That's just me. I think there's probably a lot of people that like the variation of different points, but I don't know. I miss those good old days with my pikes, defending my cities, watching enemies trying to push me back on the streets but having no goddamn luck. Siege ladders are now equipment, much like the early days of Rome 1, where you'd actually have to build them before going into a siege. Later on, they added them in as just something that any of your infantry could pull out their ass, but I'm glad that we're not doing that anymore. I'm glad it will actually take some time to build and then carry siege ladders into battles, much like other siege weaponry. And of course, sapping is back. It doesn't have the same effect as a Rome 1, but I think it's going for a more realistic version. In Rome 1, if you had sappers on the battlefield themselves, you'd actually see them start to dig the tunnel and then the walls would slowly fall down. Sappers are now used on the campaign map to slowly over time knock down and damage bits of the wall, so when you get into the battle, they've already fallen down. Now, it doesn't look quite as cinematic, but it's a bit more realistic to what actually sappers were used for in real life. Of course, now you have fire arrows having way more impact, being able to burn settlements and buildings. Fire will spread if needed to be. This also works in trees and forests, but when it comes to the sieges, this will have real effects. Of course, it will cause more chaos and loss of morale if the whole city is burning, but if you do want to capture and occupy that place, well, you're going to have to wait a little bit and spend a lot of time and money trying to rebuild what your men did. But let's head right back to the campaign. There are worthiness mechanics that have been added in, increasing legitimacy to slowly grow and gain renown over time. This is the aim, to become the greatest you can be to eventually hold the title of Pharaoh. To do this, you can capture places of interest, and once again, as mentioned, you can build monuments or wear certain crowns. Also, engage in battles with tougher odds. Winning a battle against a much harder opponent will give you more legitimacy if you win, but if you lose, the victor of that battle can now challenge you in a new civil war if they want to become the pharaoh themselves. Speaking of pharaohs, these are all built off the characters you create. Characters that can be upgraded and learn new skills, getting stronger, becoming better leaders. Things like fortitude that can increase your defensive capabilities and your armies, or you can increase the speed of armies. These are all done through competencies. Your characters can learn these titles, whether they want to be a charioteer, a jeweler, so on and so forth. They will gain this throughout time, a little bit like in Rome 1, where your leaders or your generals would gain traits that would then start to give them buffs. But these are all based on the background of your gameplay style. If you're an aggressive character and that is their background, they're more likely to gain traits that are going to make them better fighters or leaders, so on and so forth. This is a mechanic that I'm very glad is being brought back. Speaking of characters, you can now assign equipment into their inventories. This will change the bodyguard of your leader. For example, let's give them a spear. You will now get a spear unit defending your leader. What if you give them a bow? Well, now they'll have ranged units surrounding them. These can all be changed mid-campaign, but I'd assume the longer that you keep a certain unit and bodyguard around your leader, the more proficient they become in that style of weaponry. All in all, I love how much Creative Assembly are showing in terms of gameplay and information. I guess it kind of helps if there is actually more exciting information and classic Total War stuff to shout about, so that's probably why that they're giving us all this extra stuff. But I also think it's a response to the criticisms we've had in the past, especially Troy almost trying to be like a stealth release, not all that much information coming and then saying, hey, it's now on a different platform, go and have fun. And I think because of that, with the mix of the tiredness with the fantasy style of Total War, the criticism has been apparent for a long time. But I think CA are trying to pull it back, and I think they're doing a decent job. Because of the hangover and skepticism of past Total Wars, there's still a vast amount of dislikes on all their videos, but judging by the comments, I think most people are kind of skeptically optimistic, a lot like me. But once again, CA kicked me out of their partner program, so what do I have to learn from this?